So without further ado, since so many good ideas have already been discussed, I'd want us to first look into the future. Now, different speakers mentioned cryptocurrencies and blockchain. Scott, on a number of occasions, said that data is the new oil. So we talked about the tools and the technologies that are building blocks of how the solutions would be like in the future. But if you for a second could take a step back and think about the social, political, economic issues that we're having to solve. Because if we've learned anything from the past decade, is that technology changes and changes very rapidly. I mean, blockchain, the way we see it now, and the timestamping and digital notary solutions even that are based on it, were dreams in heads of incredibly eccentric cryptography researchers. And it took them a decade to voice them, and then it took other people a decade to make a business case out of it. Cryptocurrency, similarly, is less than a decade old. And we still don't know who Mr. Bitcoin is, if he does indeed exist.
And it took only 6 months to get to 20 grand and 2 weeks to fall back.
So if we first look at what are the big challenges that will need to be sustainably managed and met, and I guess go around somewhere or another. You have to talk into the talking stick.
Yeah, go ahead and solve that for us, Jeff.
Prognosticate.
I think the big challenge, since we're in a sustainable development series in this symposium, I think, going back to what I said this morning, I think the big challenge, maybe it relates to the other dimension of this, which is the digital divide dimension. So I think one of the big challenges is in terms of the capacity of people in poorer, less developed, less well-resourced jurisdictions and geographies to participate meaningfully in both the risk management aspects of all of this, but also in the opportunities and innovations and so on that come from that. And because of the pace of change of technologies, so there's not only this possibility that there'll be gross inequalities mirroring sort of developmental inequalities, but gross inequalities in capacity and technical ability, and those will just reinforce each other. But also, again, Megan talked about trust in the morning. Yes. And if trust is the coin of the cyber realm, and without it we can't do anything, then this discrepancy in abilities and resources and so on between the developed, technically capable world and parts of the less developed world, and these could straddle national boundaries, so there could be really tech-capable parts of Nairobi and very tech-incapable parts of Iowa. So it's not just the traditional developed states, undeveloped states. Is that misunderstanding or lack of knowledge about this very fast-changing tech environment could lead to distrust. And without trust, how do we build cybersecurity? Because a network is only as secure as its weakest link.
I won't kick you in the foot for taking trust from me, but I would say trust is the...
I did it with credit.
Yes, well, thank you. I appreciate it. For me, trust is the biggest one. We were joking last night about, who were we talking with? Actually, no, I was talking with Diane, I think, about sort of the 6 guys in the 6 different circles that actually keep the internet going with their relationships, and it's the 6 interlinking circles of people who know each other that fix things for us. There is not a routinized process that says, if this happens, thou shalt call so-and-so, or if it is, it's in the person's mind, not in a paper, in a book somewhere. So it's those trust relationships at various intersection points between intermediaries and the consumers that use them. So by intermediaries, I mean platforms, could be Google, it could be AT&T, could be Deutsche Telekom or Orange, or, but between governments too. So I think it's the various trust points and the weaknesses among them. But I think, to Joe's point, the digital divide and this is not a conversation about internet governance, but I will try and sort of not get too, well, I'll try not to take too long of a frolic and detour on the topic, but we have for years sort of struggled with the ability to quantify the benefits to development from the being connected. And I know that McKinsey and WEF and others are trying to figure out what that magic formula is, but last I was closely associated with this, I didn't know what it was. But at the same time, we know that the U.S. economy, Western economies are growing rapidly. We heard about the value of, and the resources that are coming to the Emirates and Dubai. And that's all happened through a non-regulatory, in large part, approach to the internet.
If I may actually, just to link to what you said earlier and what you're alluding to now, you said that fear, uncertainty, and doubt is not effective in this world. Mm-hmm. And that for me, trust through panic almost is how we've lived in here. Mm-hmm. And you suggested that we've gotten the messaging wrong, we should do something else. But in a world where development, and particularly development of security solutions, has really happened by not wasting a crisis, where it's happened the expensive way. How do we then move ahead to somewhere where it's more looking ahead and trust-based?
So I'll answer that question, but I'll quickly finish up the point on the trust point. So we have a lot of governments who are not yet online or who are not as interconnected, and there's a big battle that has sort of gone dormant, but I think it's emerging again. And the question becomes, what is the framework for trust? Is it this multi-stakeholder model, which has upheld the internet for the past, depending on when you say it began, 60, 70 years, or do we need a multilateral approach? Mm-hmm. So my argument in this paper that I will eventually get out is, if we are not careful in our way that we respond to disinformation, the way that we respond to crises with fear, uncertainty, or doubt, we will lose the trust of the users, which means we will never be able to get some of these lesser developed, which that's not the right term I'm supposed to use anymore, developing countries online. And so I think the other, I guess, to sort of answer your question, we need to be we who have been struggling with some of these issues for a longer period of time, and be much more careful in the way we handle these issues, because, as I said in response to the disinformation efforts with respect to the election, and I think this is something that Jackie was pointing out, if we're not careful in the way that we respond to this, we are playing right into the hands of those who think that we need to have states running the internet. So we got to fix it.
So since trust is the emerging theme, I'm gonna play around with it in two ways. First, I absolutely agree, but I think we need to think through what we mean by trust. And one of the conversations we were having at lunch is about the disinformation and the potential, the ways in which the internet is structured in combination with sort of fundamental human behavior to both silo how we receive information, and then within that silo to push us to further on one extreme or another, right? So if you're on an extreme and you only get your news through shared 3 networks, which turn off at 11 p.m., and you have to watch the same shows, then where the extreme is, where the margin is, tends to be a little bit closer. When you're getting your news through dedicated, self-selected internet channels that then move forward or push forward stories based on algorithms that are designed to make you click on them, and that tends to be things that are at the most extreme, the most, sort of things that'll either resonate most strongly with your views and or be the most sort of dramatic and shocking. We're in a world, and we see it, where it's really hard to figure out where trust comes in. And when you have political figures who are willing to exploit that, and then nation states who are trying to exploit that, it gets. I'm not sure how you form that trust, and I'm not sure how a centralized entity forms that trust. And then on the flip side, well, what does trust mean? Well, one thing it means is, can I trust you, right? Can I trust you to give you a loan? Can I trust you to come into my country? Can I trust you to walk through these doors and come into this room and participate in this discussion? Well, how do I create that trust? Well, I create that trust by something like the social credit score that China is creating. And so trust in that respect is something that we need to worry about. So I didn't solve anything, I just made it messier. But.
And Jackie, I know trust seems to be the emerging topic, but one of the questions you addressed so well was whether this cyber world is a game changer, and whether it's something new. And truly we're in a place where the smart people have figured out that cyber is an adjective. It could be possibly be a noun, but let's not use it as a verb unless in a very specific environment that's unacademic.
We say cyberize.
So
there's a great website called "Will Using the Prefix Cyber Make Me Look Like an Idiot.com."
The answer is
It
always
actually
yes.
exists. It exists. Go to it. It's a wonderful quiz.
So what do you see as the next game changers? What are the big challenges?
Oh, okay. So, and here I thought I had just come up with what I wanted to say to the first question.
Please do.
No. Okay, so the next game changers, I'll answer both in a way. I think the Internet of Things is definitely one of the next big game changers, as is the rollout of cryptocurrencies and blockchain and the influence that those will have. I think that the realization that we really need to have fundamental conversations about how we think about our media system and our public sphere, and that the digital public sphere can't just be, we can't just completely apply the rules of the past to this, that it's different, that it has different issues that it raises. I think that's going to be one of the big game changers, and how we have that conversation. I agree with what Megan said. It's going to be one of those things that if we get it wrong, then we're going to have more of a fragmentation, we're going to have less sustainability, we're going to have more of a state-centric approach. And we may have some of that anyway. But I think that those are all big changes. I also would like to second the theme of the way in which these changes occur in the developing world. So the internet started out in the US and in Europe and has spread. And until now, the majority of users have, for the vast history of the internet, been in Western democracies. That has obviously changed with the digitization of China, Russia, of a number of countries, but there still are large parts of the world where not as many people are using the internet as frequently, and that is all changing. And as that changes, the center of gravity of the internet as a global network of networks is going to change fundamentally towards the majority of users being in non-Western countries, in countries that speak different languages, in countries that are in the developing world, and that in some cases don't have as good as much rule of law in some cases have enormous poverty or inequality gulfs, which are of a different sort of magnitude, and the level below poverty level of a different order of magnitude, which can lead to different dynamics. I mean, we're all familiar with the sort of stereotypical Nigerian scam email and things like this. But you can understand the dynamics that drive that kind of crime when you're talking about a world in which people are going online for the first time who are living in utter poverty, and this can be a mechanism by which to connect with places that have a lot more wealth. Obviously, that's not the way most people are using it, though. And one has to think about how to deal with this in a way that is fair, how fairness can be part of the approach, and how it can be fair and at the same time can allow for self-realization. Some of you may be familiar with the scandal around free basics in India a couple of years ago, where the Indian Supreme Court forced Facebook to stop providing its free basics capability on cell phones as violating network neutrality, because it only allowed access to certain digital materials, certain sites with a heavy Western bias. And one can easily understand why that would be problematic, could be seen as neocolonialism. Didn't help that there was a tweet by one of the Facebook board members shortly afterwards saying it's like turning down the best parts of the colonial heritage. So one has to think really hard about how these things play out in a way that is fair. I think many of the problems are different because of the interconnectedness, but many of them also are the same. And when I got into studying the topic that eventually led me to studying internet in authoritarian regimes, studying civil society and its role in different types of societies, democracies, authoritarian states, a couple of the pivotal texts in the late 2000s or mid to late 2000s that were widely discussed were works by a guy named Robert Putnam, a political scientist, about social capital and about civic community and about the decline in civil society and trust and organizational life in America, about the ways in which trust in institutions can play a long historic role in either strengthening democracy or weakening it where there isn't that trust in different societies. One of his books compared southern and northern Italy, showing that democratic institutions tended to fail in the setting where there wasn't a long history of trust of institutions, that there wasn't as much civic engagement. Some of these issues, and actually Putnam himself argued that the internet was going to be a problem for civic community and social engagement, civil society. I remember one of my first papers I wrote in graduate school was trying to refute this argument, saying the internet actually is good for social engagement, and I look at these new networks that are emerging as forums for civic engagement. Now we see that this is all too black and white. It's much more complicated. And the internet itself has been described, Zittrain has this great quip where he says that the internet was built by a group of people who trusted each other and were all scientists working in labs who communicated, and they didn't feel a need for security because they trusted each other. They were a trusted network, an epistemic community, if you will. And says, it's like what's happened with the internet, it's like how many of you know what Burning Man is? Mm-hmm. A few of you. Okay, it's this libertarian art festival in Nevada in the summers, in the middle of the desert, that brings something like 300,000 people together in the summer doing art installments and camps and for a week. Anyway, it's what?
It's like Yanni Payo. Sort of.
It's the one day we have sunshine in Estonia when we're manic depressive because of that. We're manic for one day.
So this is the equivalent for Silicon Valley nerds. And he says it's like if you took the anti-government sort of local libertarian festival of Burning Man and moved it to Manhattan, and it continued to work just as well. That's what the internet has been like, in that it expanded and expanded for the longest time, even as more and more users who didn't have the same trusted community network they were part of joined. It continued to work and continued to work well and expanded to include commerce and so on. And of course you have then had crime and security threats start to nip at that, but it's still remarkable how well it has worked as it's expanded. And I think it comes down to the same sorts of questions about institutions and civic life, and you can't separate the internet completely from those things in other contexts of life. And I think some of the problems we're dealing with things like democracy and democratic sustainability today have more to do with fundamentals of civic trust and civic engagement than they do with whether it's digital or not. And with inequality in society leading to greater polarization that just gets reinforced and mirrored online. And one can reinforce it more or less. You can create positive or negative feedback loops to make it increase or decrease, but those problems exist not completely because of the role of the technology and need to be addressed. And then in thinking about it globally, this is a technology that can connect people across boundaries. It can be a technology of globalization in the positive sense of the word, in the positive sense of connecting people to understand other people's cultures, to communicate across borders. I certainly have friends in many countries through my social media accounts, and I think a lot of people do. And yet it also can contribute to greater division because these are huge monolithic organizations. The more they play a role that's seen as sort of neo-colonial or not fair and contributing to greater inequality, the more problematic it can become. So I think it requires many forms of engagement, thinking about those fundamentals of how do you have the sort of cultural globalization that is more contributing to mutual understanding without having the exploitative sort of expansion, and how do you maintain legitimacy and trust and fairness while you do it.
Right, thank you. And I think if the first four panelists have clearly, proven again that Robert Putnam's beautiful metaphor of bowling alone has, it's still as relevant in the modern digital age as it ever has been. Just the means of how we bowl, to use the same metaphor, might have changed.
My paper was called Surfing Together.
Nice.
So, but something that perhaps you can also address as we go on dreaming of the future is the opportunity of having a blank slate. Because when talking about development and bridging the digital divide, in terms of also economic development of nations, then there is so much opportunity in having a blank slate in not having legacy systems, in the lack of things having always been done like that. I mean, you have the stories of how there's certain media economies in world that skipped the paper-based news distribution and went directly to radio and mobile phone, based the check-based banking, which is slow, stupid, insecure, and had been done for 100 years in this part of the world and in large parts of Western Europe, and went directly to mobile. Part of the reasons why Estonia is such a lively ecosystem is that we skipped checks. We went directly from this, what was called banking books, to fully digital. So when I suffered for 90 minutes when the online banks were down in 2007, I just moved to Estonia from New York, where I had to suffer for 2 weeks whilst my payments cleared through a check. So maybe looking ahead, if you think of where those opportunities are, the opportunities of having a vast expanse in front of us.
So it pains me that I'm going to play the old man card, which I don't feel old enough to do, but I realize now I've been kicking around the internet now professionally for 30 years. And I'm thinking back to the late 80s. Those of you who remember, computer security was a term that was just starting to come about because who here knows the Morris worm? A few hands. Okay, one of the first early seminal computer security events, which would be laughable today, wouldn't even make the noise on the internet. But just to give you an example of sort of policy debates we were having back then, the big raging question on the internet was whether or not commercial traffic was allowed. Right? This would happen, I kid you not. Somebody would every once in a while send out a for sale notice, and this would cause a big debate as whether or not you could use the internet to sell things. So now we fast forward the mid-90s, the web's invented, there's a whole .com boom. 2007, I think, is another seminal knee with the iPhone, right, putting the internet into everyone's hands. My point is the rate of change, and thinking about the big challenges, and as I see this, it's exploded over this 30 years of my professional life, and this is stressing every other part of our society, from things like, we talked about WannaCry and the fact that people are still running XP, and we can snicker sort of about that, but our procurement cycles are not set up to be fast enough to even keep up with things reaching end of life. I've got Android tablets at home that I still love using. They're great form factor. They're no longer getting security updates, much less DoD and big companies dealing with that, or our legal and policy systems, right? We're wrestling with how do we come up with policies for something like Facebook or Twitter that exploded onto the scene. We've never had anything connect so many billions of people so quickly, and we don't even know how to deal with the ramifications in that speed. So one of the big tensions I see there, I mean, I think we're great at taking advantage of all the opportunities that we have here, and the problem is I think we're seeing the double-sided sword of this at speed, and I think there's going to be a real fundamental question we're going to have to answer in the upcoming couple of decades, which is, do we, and this pains me to say as an engineer and a researcher myself, but do we have to slow down the innovation to make this manageable? Can we keep letting this sort of run at the unbridled rate that it has been running for the past 3 decades? Or is it just going to keep, what I see, increasingly get away from us?
So strict liability for software companies for bugs in code would be the solution. Talk about stopping innovation.
I don't even think we know. All right?
Yeah, no, fair enough.
We can push the pendulum around wildly in a 3-dimensional space and try to hope to get the answer.
Yeah. No, that's right. So, one of the things I use Known for is the Lynn and Vincent Ostrom workshop, right? And the kind of model they played with for a long, long time is this idea of polycentric governance, right? So this idea of how can we make multiple levels, multiple stakeholders work well together, play well together, and build towards some common vision. Most of what they were concerned with are kind of the use of local resources like fisheries, forests. Toward the end of her career, Lynn was particularly interested in climate change. Before she passed a few years ago. I think there's a lot there that we can learn in the internet governance and the cybersecurity context, frankly. That's one thing I'm encouraged for when I hear talks like Wafa earlier today, when she was talking about how Eli Lilly is now including cybersecurity and data privacy up front in their integrated sustainability report. They're trying to be really transparent, and this is what we're doing to make this ecosystem more secure. And I think, as more companies start to do that, and as it's required more, so there's a World Conference of Stock Exchanges, if you guys aren't aware, and there's guidelines that all these stock exchanges, including NYSE and NASDAQ, which are members, they operate under. This association is now requiring publicly traded companies over a certain market cap to issue sustainability reports. So as more of these organizations do that, or are forced to do it, and they start to include cybersecurity and data privacy, that could have some knock-on effects pretty quickly, frankly, particularly if they require that from all their vendors and their huge supply chains. So I'm encouraged by that. And I'm encouraged by, I'm the cyber peace guy, after all. So I try to be optimistic, similar to Joe here, right? And one of the things to think through as well, this whole polycentric idea, one of the reasons the 2015 Paris Accord on climate change has been successful to an extent is that it started with this whole process of national, bilateral, regional pledges to build momentum on up to the actual negotiations in Paris, right? So one thing we've been playing with, a small group of us, is how can we do something similar, for cybersecurity? How can we get coalitions or even individual countries to start announcing these are the types of things we're going to do to make this problem more manageable, and then build momentum toward different norms or rules of the road, even if it's not a treaty, right? So I think by looking at some of those models, we shouldn't necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater. Some of those can still make sense in this context. But I'll pass the crystal ball maybe to Marios. Maybe you can help fill in some of the gaps there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I like that part, that last part of sustainability risk analysis. In the company world, we call it enterprise risk management. Right?
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Thank you all. I'm the last one, I presume. Now, here's another view. Have you ever thought what the world would be if everything was perfect? You would not need weapons. You would not need cyber. You would not need cybersecurity, right? The world is far from being safe. As a strategist, I'm saying this because there is now more than ever two things: more sales and arms of weapons and software that come with it on the cyber element around the globe. And two, with the climate change, you have a new president that withdrew.
Well, we've started the process for withdrawing. Hopefully that will change by the time it actually happens.
I'm just saying that the momentum can be stopped by a non-expected variable, which is called the asymmetrical threat. In 2007, nobody would have assumed that people would have attacked Estonia or any country relevant with this. The attack on Estonia had a strategic reason why it was Estonia. Not because they wanted to show to Estonians that not only they didn't like them what they were doing, but there was a strategic reason why they did it. Am I right?
You'd have to ask Vladimir Vladimirovich.
Okay. Well, there was a strategic goal, like there was a strategic goal with Crimea. What I'm trying to say is the following. If everything would be perfect, you would probably not be acquiring new information, new technology, and there would not be advancement. That's number one. Number two, the question was very simple about the future, how we estimate the future. In my morning speech, I said that everything is bonded together now through the element of the internet, through cyber something, including cyber safety and cybersecurity. Now imagine the world gets together, right? And everything is now interconnected, everything is shared, and you have a big database around the globe. What happens next? We'll talk about the future. Talk about the merger of artificial intelligence with genetics. We're talking about the merger of the internet with robotics. We'll talk about the merger of the internet becoming parts and souls of our brains and our fingers and our hands. We'll talk about digital identities inside our bodies, right, to start with. We're talking about senses and censorship of ethical and moral values that are not there yet, which means that before we actually anticipate the future, we should anticipate what the law should look like, if this law is universal, if it's applicable regional, national, and stuff like that. And then we need to anticipate whether there's a vision of how the world will be more safe and sound and peaceful. So far as the world is not peaceful, we use and utilize technology on the benefit of the defense of our countries, rather than defense of our own people in order to be safe, sound, and produce something new. What I'm trying to say is that when we mix society with cybersecurity, when we're talking about cyber development and cyber democracy, we should be very much familiar about the moral values, the constitutional values that come with it, with every single country, and the laws that come with it. What do we mean when we actually talk about democracy? While we talk about the freedom of speech, the freedom of media, and so on and so forth. Because the internet has facilitated these things happening, but it also facilitated things, what we said about the freedom of the internet, to be utilized from the ones who do not expect or who do not wish to utilize the internet to create revolutions, to create wars, to disseminate wrong information, maybe to be infiltrating into other countries' politics, as it stands as of today. So that being said, let us assume that we guarantee everything. We're talking about a new age technology, not even the 4th generation revolution, we're talking about the 5th. And that we combine everything technologically agile to the use of human beings, rather to utilization towards the human beings. Does it make sense for you? We're not going to create drones to utilize for the benefit of our business, but we're going to be utilizing, for example, drones for the benefit of the protection of our children. So when you see science fiction movies, right, and you see those cameras doing the mapping all around. I was watching on the plane a movie, Prometheus, right, where there was that camera that was doing GIS mapping of the place of the spaceship, but it was following always the human being that was walking with. Now that's a future. Since somebody mentioned Apple, first contract of Apple, do you know what it was? Hollywood. The initial weapons were rejected. You know what was the first movie? Aliens. Sigourney Weaver. You know those nice guns and nice radars? That was Apple. Okay? They showed the future. Google Glasses, you remember that there's a funny thing running around the internet, like, you know, Star Trek has been showing us the future since the 1970s, where they're showing Google Glass and iPads and phones and stuff like that. Do not be afraid of the future. Just make sure that the future is utilized for the benefit of you and sound people and sound leaders. That's what I'm trying to say. The ethical and moral value is that the use of technology for medicine, for example, should be used for peaceful purposes. That's why I consider that the law should be drafted first on the universal uses of technology in cybersecurity, or cyber something, whatever this may be. Because now we're not talking about cybersecurity, but we're talking about the cybernetics of things. We're not talking about the Internet of Things any longer. Internet of Things is done. The big data process is the next step. And after the big data, when you will merge this, imagine, I don't know if any of you follow a bit of medicine, but the book of the DNA. Imagine if you mix the book of the DNA with cyber elements. That's a future. And if you believe that this doesn't exist, it does exist, more so in developing countries which have nothing to lose. Because the developing countries need to go fast-paced now in order to keep up with the developed countries. That's why you see companies like Facebook that wants to give global internet to countries that don't have the basic infrastructure, that they want to give cellular coverage in countries that don't have cellular adaptation of infrastructure. For example, in the 80s and the 90s, when Lucent Technologies was doing the creation of cellular in China or Iran, nobody said anything about the future. So the future right now looks that you're going to merge every single aspect of technology with them, and you're going to merge every single aspect of society as it exists with that result that comes out from technology. I don't know if that helps you, but yeah.
Absolutely, and Marius actually, if I may paraphrase you or sum you up, reminded us of the very fundamental question where my approach to this was also rooted in, which is that we're past the stage of an innovation fetish, where because it's new and it's technology, it must be good, we must somehow move on with it. And we've gotten back to thinking of what are the legal or constitutional or democratic requirements or needs that we're fulfilling, and what is the social need, what's the added value that innovation and security is providing to society. But with that, do we have any questions from the audience? Because I have about 24 good questions, which will safely take us through to tomorrow lunchtime when I have to fly out. But are there any questions from the audience? If not at this point, we've talked about the what should be done, but this is how policies fail. The policy of this shall be done fails. The policy of this person does that becomes a plan that's implementable. So a common thread throughout the talks and presentation was that individual responsibility and educating the user and hoping for the best is simply not a sustainable solution. It's a solution that will fail us. It's like telling people to do their own dentistry. That just ends up with a nation of people with really bad teeth. Where's the balance between the actors and the doers, between corporations and nation states? If we take out the individual, we'll never educate every single computer user to do their own network security. There have to be reasonable solutions that they can buy into. Now, Jackie talked about responsible vulnerability disclosure, which is mostly a corporate issue. She also mentioned what's called the Cyber Geneva Convention, something that I'm enthusiastically negative about, which is a Microsoft initiative to start formalizing some of the norms of behavior in cyberspace. And I'm negativistic about it because I believe that's a job of nation states. And then, Wafa spoke at length about creating a safe environment, creating an environment where your pacemaker doesn't fail because anyone can hack into it with a Wi-Fi network, has been done. Or, people make mistakes because the way numbers are placed on pacemakers, they can run from left to right, from right to left, from top to bottom, from bottom to top. And if you're a person who relies on that technology, that assumes that in a time of emergency, when you're having to press those buttons, you're aware enough to understand how the numbers run. So who's responsible there? And I think we'll do a sort of a quick fire round. Is it the nation states? Is it corporations? Or is it that there's no one size fits all and there's issues where nation states are targeted and cyber is politicized, where it has to be a nation state response? But then there's problems that corporations created, such as Spectre, where nation state responses are close to useless. Any takers?
Oh, just real quick, I want to return to two thoughts related. So one analogy, since I'm the one who knocked down analogies, but no, there are good ones. In the United States, initially the approach to automotive safety, and an approach that was pushed heavily by industry, was that you got to drive better. I thought it was when you're dentistry. We don't need standards. Tort liability can take care of it in the extremes, but the real problem is user failure. And there's a little bit of that going on. We talk about cyber hygiene, and I agree. I think we ultimately realized, no, we can design cars that are safer. We can design roads that are better. And so I absolutely think that the solutions here and that paradigm shift, I mean, it's not that it hasn't taken place, but it needs to take place even more. And then I want to come back to a point that I raised and Joe re-raised, but I think insurance actually has a pretty big role to play here. And what's interesting is insurance, when you look at the insurance industry, the cyber risk industry, they originally saw it as just a market opportunity. It was just an add-on. It was a way to increase margin. And then they quickly realized, well, hold on, we actually have no real ability to assess what the risk is here. And so they're facing this problem. They haven't solved it yet. But what they realized, and what the conversation is focused on, and the reason it's so hard is part of the same reason that cybersecurity is hard writ large, is that there's not like an isolated, demarcated cyber risk, right? If you're an industrial control system and your industrial controls control, some sort of safety mechanism, a dam, whatever, well, cyber risk is, real risk in terms of something really significant happening. And then, less significantly, cyber risk can affect many aspects of your business. And so insurance is working really, really hard trying to figure this out. And one of the solutions there is, of course, more and better data about it. And so I think, on a positive note, I think that insurance is one player we don't often think about that can kind of straddle many of these roles and begin to embed responsibility and leverage the data that they're able to collect to make sort of better economic choices about where to put that liability. And then also to try to, aggregate risk in the way that insurance does.
Yeah, so I was going to come to insurance as my third point.
That's why I grabbed it first. I knew you were doing it.
My first point, I guess, would be to your point about how we need to get back to frameworks and policy and law needs to catch up with technology. Hilary Charlesworth is kind of former ANU academic, has shown quite persuasively that international law is what she calls a discipline of crisis. So it tends to make advances in normative consensus and so on around particular crisis events and very seldom makes those normative advances kind of in an anticipatory fashion. So I don't see I'm persuaded by that, and I don't necessarily see what would change in terms of conventional, formal international law frameworks. But they're not the only governance systems that matter. So that's my second point, that a lot of the models, and that's the Ostrom legacy around co-governance and shared responsibility, seem to be either ideal or inevitable in this space. The downside of that, I suppose, is in all governance schemes involving joint responsibility, there's a risk that no one actor, because by definition no one actor has ultimate responsibility, that responsibility can actually fall between the stools. So everyone's responsible, but no one's actually ultimately responsible. So there's a risk in those kind of otherwise very kind of intuitively appealing co-governance, polycentric kind of models. And thirdly, it's about returning to drivers and incentives, and that's the insurance point. We need to think of what are the bottlenecks that all behavior at some point has to pass through. And some of these are boring, mundane, commercial drivers that are ultimately unignorable. So in the other work I do in relation to regulating corporate supply chains around modern slavery and human trafficking and so on, who is a regulator? Well, we always think it's the Australian federal government or the United Nations Security Council, what have you. But some of the regulation that matters the most comes from private industry bodies that generate norms, such as insurers, and until these sorts of entities, investors, insurers, lenders, start creating, making as contractual conditions and procurement conditions and other conditions these sorts of requirements, then I don't think we're likely to see as much change as we could otherwise.
Then we have a maximum of 10 minutes, I think, of the session remaining. So
Okay.
speak fast.
Okay.
Sorry.
Let's see here. Okay, so to the question of who is responsible, and sort of the implicit question about governance structures and norms. A few points which I've scrawled here, and I'll try to make coherent. One is I wanted to say something about the Cyber Geneva and the role of non-state actors or corporations in promoting norms, just because this is something studying transnational activism and civil society way back, I have a background in, and a lot of the sort of historic moments of norm promotion internationally actually have come from non-state actors playing a significant role as norm promoters, as norm entrepreneurs. So if you look, for example, at the Anti-Landmine Convention or the Jubilee debt relief to developing countries, or even back at the Geneva Conventions and the creation of the Red Cross, there have been private actors, civil society actors, organizations, networks, individual activists, sometimes corporations playing significant roles in these. If you look up the Landmine Convention, Princess Diana, who you often see playing a significant role, and on Jubilee, the musician whose name I've never known whether I'm saying it right, Bono. There's an academic article I remember reading because the name stuck in my head. It was so funny how Bono made Jesse Helms cry about the role of these sorts of non-state actor players in influencing key decision makers within democracies to persuade them to come over. And in the effects of sort of influence campaigns on non-democratic societies for rights activism, you often have effects where activist networks within the society are in touch with activist networks internationally who then agitate their own governments to put pressure back on that country. So there are often complex multi-level relationships between these actors, and it takes sort of a multiple stage effect, multiple stage sequence to lead to the dissemination of ideas about norms and ultimate agreement between states. States aren't always the first actors. So while I agree with the idea that just having Microsoft say it is nice and good for their branding and doesn't necessarily lead to any real influence, I'm hesitate to dismiss it as not having potential influence, especially if they're not the only actor involved. The other thing on that is, I think, branding can be good or bad. In sustainability, you see this. You see greenwashing, where corporations have one product line, for example, that is organic or environmentally sustainable, and it doesn't contain any harmful chemicals and is produced sustainably. And all their other major product lines are terrible. And they use the promotion of that one product line to make themselves look like they're doing the right thing for the environment. You have other corporations that have played major roles as small niches in driving, being norm entrepreneurs, like Seventh Generation, for example. And then you have major corporations, which it's sometimes a mixed picture, just like any organizational politics. I mean, organizations like Walmart, for example, which does many things good and many things bad, but has made a major shift in efforts to redirect their whole supply chain towards following certain norms in terms of sustainability and their corporate practices. And often there are complex organizational politics in play. So I think branding can be, it comes down to this issue: can you align the interests of a corporation with interests that are good for society at large in a way which is mutually beneficial? And sometimes that can actually work. I mean, the things to look for are they being hypocritical? Are they saying one thing out of one side of their mouth and doing another thing elsewhere? And you see that sometimes with some of the internet companies and tech companies, and sometimes you don't. Like, for example, on rights, which companies are turning over information about their users to governments in order to get the bottom line in countries where they have to, and then making a big stand on issues in other countries. And, what are the politics driving that? In terms of the overall who's responsible and governance structures question, I guess that brings me to, I think, there are collective action problems in any governance arrangement for dealing with these kinds of tricky global issues, because this really is a global issue. And the more actors that are engaged with trying to find solutions, I think often trying to think of the one solution that works as the one solve-all fix is magical thinking and isn't going to actually work. There are always problems, but the more different solutions you're working on at once and different actors are engaged with, that can probably have more of a dynamic overall positive effect going forward. Thanks.
Right, so let's carry on pointing fingers in this incredibly complex world where there's many actors with competing interests, and the one process that was hoped would set the baseline standard. The United Nations group of governmental experts might or might not bounce back from being completely broken to the point of people walking out of it, nations walking out of it. So who can fix it?
Maybe I'll try to be a little provocative here. I don't think government looking down the road is going to have a huge role in fixing this. As I look at the trends, it is going to be the IT companies, perhaps with pressure from government, perhaps with pressure from insurance, perhaps with pressure from the public, but they are more and more going to be the ones that own the device. On the far technical end of the spectrum, in the old days, we patched I patched my computer. I chose what software it ran it. More and more now, it's the walled garden, and eventually, I don't think I'll even be able to answer the question: do I want this updated or not? I'm not going to have a choice, right? They're going to take responsibility for that. Perhaps more relevant to this group, something like Facebook, which tried to take more of a common carrier approach. Hey, we just connect people, but we don't stay to the conversations. Is going to be dragged more and more into hate speech, fake news, and managing content around it. Right? They are going to have responsibility pushed on them. That pushing may come from various places, but I think they're the ones that's going to take it. I think government's too slow to do more than the pressure approach. I don't know about insurance. I think the jury's still out on it. It's got promise. We're going to see. That's going to be a harder one for me to prognosticate on. I haven't seen evidence yet. Maybe.
So, quick questions to the two of you. Does international law help? And does international cooperation help?
Yes to both, absolutely, right? There's been various proposals for a new fora to consider now that the GGE has kind of wound down, at least temporarily. One that I've heard a little bit about recently is a G20 plus ICT20 format. So you get the G20 in the room with some of the biggest tech companies, see what rules of the road. These could just be a non-binding list of best practices, but at least to be a start. I share Vaughn's skepticism a little bit on the insurance front. A lot of these companies, though, are putting more and more money behind it, and there's some cool work coming out, including of Illinois, here where you were before this, Vaughn. So I'm encouraged that hopefully in the next few years we're going to see some more maturity there, and it could help us with the solution a little bit. If nothing else, shining a harsh light on companies that want to get covered and find out that they can't, like happened to a couple of British power grid companies just a few years ago, right? That's a problem when you're a critical infrastructure company and can't get a cyber risk insurance coverage. In preparing for this, I did look at the Silent Spring book that I mentioned in the beginning, and Rachel Carson does have a quote that I'll wind up my remarks with. In the introduction, she said, it's relevant here, she's speaking about a small U.S. town, not unlike Bloomington, perhaps, right? And she said, the town is now blighted by, in this case, a white granular powder. It was not caused by witchcraft, she said, that people had done it to themselves. Right? And that's equally true, I think, in sustainability and cybersecurity, right? We're to blame, and we're also the solution. And it's a shared responsibility. That's a challenge. And I think getting that mix right is the difficult part. We are doing some work now on how to design better and more effective institutions. The Ostroms for decades put out this institutional analysis and design framework, this list of principles for how effective institutions do good and how those that do okay could do better. We're updating those right now for cybersecurity, internet governance questions. So anybody who's interested in that effort, see me afterward. We'll get you on the list. There's a lot of cool stuff that we're working on. But I'm still, at the end of the day, hopeful about all this. So thank you.
Thank you. I will utilize that
Oh yeah.
paraphrasing thing.
Yeah.
We are the solution. right? But I'll pinpoint it down to, you will not change ever leadership of an elected government. The government will always be the regulatory authority that will be creating the rules and the laws. But behind the regulatory authority are human beings, that element, that we are the solution, but I'm just pinpointing it to very specific. We have to be careful who are our leaders. We have to be careful about our leadership strengths. We have to know who we put in that specific chair to take those decisions. It's very important. It's very important because these people will be taking solid decisions for the rest of us. You know, whether this is national or international. Everything else is operational. ICTs are operational, consulting firms are operational, legal firm groups are operational. The difference is, and that is the element of democracy, that's why I said we need to know our democracies in this case. The regulatory authorities are the legally binding laws that are passing through Senate or Congress or any other government level, if you want, around this globe. That's when the law becomes binding. That's when you apply it. Those people that signing are those people that are utilizing through their own teams to create that law. So far and as long as we can have those people inside, because until now what we say is like, I need a good lawyer, I need a good doctor, maybe I need a good HR as friends. Now I need a good ICT guy. You know, this is a reality of things. The people that need to take the strong decisions should be the people that know. But without leadership and without vision, you can never, ever move ahead. That's what I had to say. Thank you.
I mean, if nothing else, then today I believe has proven to all of us again that it's an exciting time to be in this sector. And one of the reasons for this excitement is that there are so many bridges to cross in figuring out how to do this long-term and in a sustainable way of building ecosystems. And a lot of those silos or bridges, or what need for bridges between the silos, have been addressed. You know, the fact that the technical elite and the policy elite are pointing fingers at each other, calling each other's names that I couldn't possibly repeat here, but doing that very publicly and including on social media. The fact that corporations and governments still view data protection, information security, and physical safety as three different disciplines, whereas they're just different sides of the same equation. The fact, which several of the panelists addressed earlier, that we've not figured out a way of communicating this clearly enough, that the figures of speech, the messaging, is still being developed. And frankly, there's plenty of players who enjoy playing in that strategic ambiguity. Attribution is a big one that's not been really discussed here, where we used to think that digital forensics, the hot trail, the way law enforcement looks at crime is the way to go, but we've now come to realize that, I mean, the cyber attacks against Estonia in 2007 came from the IP ranges of over 150 nation states, but there's Vatican City included, by the way, but there's very few that would have the motivation, the capabilities, and would enjoy doing it at that time, in that moment. But when you're protecting your networks, you might never have the resource to do the digital forensics because availability, confidentiality, and data integrity will always be your priority. So there's a lot of these different balances that the sector is figuring out, where the academia is contributing, where in many ways industry is setting the standard and then government gets to decide whether they'll take that on or not. But all in all, the fundamental message from a lot of this is that it's not riskier, it's just different risks. And as societies, economies, and political systems, we need to be ready and manage a world where uncertainty will always be a part of any of your solutions. So you have to have that resilience, that readiness to deal with vulnerabilities before they become real risks. And with that, I think, Scott, it's your turn to close up.
Oh, yeah. No, that's You did a great job, Lisa. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, let's do it. No, it's been such a pleasure, guys. I can't thank all of you enough, and thank you for sticking with us on an absolutely beautiful afternoon. So maybe after this we can go outside for a little bit and chat. But this has been an interest area of mine for some time on sustainable development and cybersecurity. I'm so thrilled to see that it's becoming more and more of an interest to a wider group, and I think we've even expanded it further today. So again, for all of you who traveled so far and did such a wonderful job today, thank you, guys. Please join me in thanking them for their wonderful efforts, and thank all of you as well for your questions and your participation.